back again, this time with a follow-up video for my October TBR. Since I went through the trouble of making an official October TBR, I thought that I should come back and talk about what I actually did read during that month. So the first book that I read in October was not actually on that TBR because it was 3 or 4 days into October already by the time I did the video, and I had already read this book, and it is called We Spread by Ian Reid. Now, this was a pre-order. It came out in September, so it's brand new. And the reason I pre-ordered this was because I had previously read I'm Thinking of Ending Things with Rachel's book club over at the Shades of Orange, and I absolutely hated it. It was an insanely popular book. I think they made a movie out of it, and I just thought it was terrible. It was just a terrible, boring, generic book in my own opinion, and I'm so sorry if this is one of your favorites. I won't go all into the details about why I didn't like it, but I did do a video on it, so I'll put a linky box up here with that video, and I'll have it linked down in my description as well. But I wanted to give the author another try before I decided he wouldn't be an author for me. So I did pre-order this, and I did read it right away, and unfortunately I didn't like this one either. It was an extremely tedious read, and I'm not even going to lie, I actually skimmed through several parts of this book. This book is about an old woman with dementia, and the dementia gets progressively worse as you follow her through the book, and there's no actual plot. We're literally just following this woman through her daily activities: eating, getting ready for the day, dressing, grocery shopping, her thoughts, her really random thoughts that she has. And then she gets taken into a long-term care facility, a very small long-term care facility. And then, of course, we continue to follow her there, her interactions with the aides and what I'm assuming is the nurse, her interactions with the other residents, her painting, and she's very confused. So she just doesn't remember what's happening, and she thinks she's being held prisoner, and she just doesn't know what's going on, and it's extremely terrifying for her every time she has a moment of lucidity. She can't remember, like months will have passed and she doesn't remember any of it. So from her perspective, it's extremely terrifying, but it was extremely tedious to read. There was no suspense, there was no twist, there was no climax. However, it did have something good about it, which I'm Thinking of Ending Things did not have anything good for me. And that was what it's like to be elderly and suffering from dementia. I thought this man has to have somebody in his life who is elderly and suffers from dementia, a grandparent or a great aunt or uncle or something to that effect, because he has clearly observed somebody with this issue, or maybe he worked in healthcare at some point. I don't know. It was very, very believable. So it had that going for it. If you are in healthcare, especially nursing, you might be interested in reading it just for the imagining of that. I actually don't recommend it. It was really hard to get through. But if you are interested and you do like Ian Reid, it would certainly be worth reading for you. The next book I read was A Night in Lonesome October by Roger Zelazny. I love Roger Zelazny. He's one of my favorite authors. And this book is exceptionally fun. So this was actually a reread for me. I read this first in 2019. I don't want to tell you too much about the plot of the story, because if you're going to read it, it's best to go in as blind as possible. Like, I wouldn't even read the synopsis in the back. I would just dive in blind if I were you. This is about it's all told from a dog's point of view, from the point of view of a dog. And there's a lot of supernatural events taking place in this book. And the dog and his master are there for this one particular event, and they have to go on a bit of a scavenger hunt in order to participate in the event. And all of the other characters in the book are there for the same reason and doing the same thing. And there's a lot of sort of spying on each other and try to outguess each other and things of this nature. It is so much fun. And all the other characters in this book were pulled directly from old stories. I will give you 2 examples because I don't want to spoil the fun of trying to figure out who all the characters are in the book. So one of the characters is Sherlock Holmes, and that's not hard to figure out. They don't use the name Sherlock Holmes, but they call him the Great Detective. And he's got the pipe, so you automatically know that that's who it is. And then another character that's very, very obvious is Dracula. So in half the fun of this book is just trying to figure out who all the characters are, because he doesn't directly name any of them. So I had a lot of fun just trying to figure out who the characters are and trying to figure out what was going on, because you have no idea what's going on when you first go into the story. And it's also illustrated. Now, I don't particularly like the illustrations. I think the illustrations are not my style of cartooning, and they're very, very cartoony. Let me find a couple of examples for you. So here's one example. Find another one here. Trying not to show you any illustrations that are going to be spoilers, because some of the illustrations are in fact spoilers, or will tell you who the characters are, and I don't want to spoil that. Here we go. Here's another one right here. So when I read this the first time, I took a lot of notes. So in my tabs here, you can see these orange tabs. The orange tabs are from my original read of this book. Now, I have to admit, when I picked it up this year, I realized I had completely forgotten the book almost entirely. I remembered a few random scenes here and there, but I couldn't remember exactly what the event was at the end, and I couldn't remember the outcome of the event, and I couldn't remember so many of the scenes in this book. And then I also couldn't remember most of the characters. I had to refigure out all the characters again. So much fun. I just had a blast with this book. It is also divided into 31 chapters, and the idea is that you read one chapter every day throughout the month of October, so you can go on the adventure with the characters. And I got to about the 10th of October, and then I couldn't take it anymore, and I just burned down the rest of the book in one night. It was just so much fun to read. I just absolutely loved it. So the green tabbies were the notes that I took from this time around. And do you know that how many notes did I take? I took around 11 to 13 notes each time. And there was only one of them that were in the same place. My notes from the first time were in a totally different place from the notes that I took this time. And they were completely different thoughts. I had completely different thoughts through both reads. And so it was just so much fun to go back when I was done with the book, to go back and read my original notes and what my thoughts were. So yeah, this was the read of the year for me. I had more fun reading this than any other book throughout this entire year. So, another book I read was The Howling by Gary Brandner. I was working 12-hour shifts overnight, and I was working by myself, so I read it in the middle of the night alone in an older facility that has a lot of creaking and settling type noises. And this book was so ominous and suspenseful that I actually got creeped out, and I can't ever remember time that a book has ever creeped me out. I don't think I've ever read a book and actually felt creeped out from reading. That this doesn't happen to me. I don't get affected by horror novels that way. This one had a lot of ominous scenes that made you feel a little suspicious of your surroundings. Every time there was a creak, I had to get up and look down the hall just to make sure nobody was there. So in case you don't know, I'm sure everybody knows what The Howling is. This is a werewolf novel. The woman in this book experiences a traumatic event right in the beginning. So her and her husband decide to rent a house out in the middle of nowhere in order to just be away from the city and take in the peace and quiet for a while. But while they're there, really strange things start occurring with the people in this really small town that's just a few miles down the road. And every single night, this woman wakes up hearing howling coming from the woods. But yeah, this book was great. I only gave it 3 stars, but the only reason I gave it 3 stars is because the writing was just not great. But the story itself was wonderful. The next book I read was The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury, which I thought at first was a middle grade book. It's actually not a middle grade book. It's probably a young adult to adult novel. And this edition is really nice. I'll actually show it to you. Not only does it have a beautiful dust jacket, as you can see, but it has marvelous, wonderful illustrations. It has both color illustrations, like this one here. Beautiful, beautiful illustrations. Love the illustrations. Then it also has some black and white illustrations, which I'll show you here. Beautiful. And then it also has these other little illustrations stuck in at the bottom of the text, like this one, and sort of on the side of the text, like this one here. See? So the illustrations in this book, this is a first-rate book. I absolutely love the book itself. However, I was not a super fan of the story. Actually, it's not the story. It is the writing. I feel a little traitory saying that I didn't like Ray Bradbury's writing in this book, but I just didn't. It was supposed to be whimsical and nostalgic, and it was. It was both of those things. In fact, it was very nostalgic. As a matter of fact, I feel like the best person to read this book is a nostalgic adult. You know, if you were a kid who went out with a group of friends and went trick-or-treating and there just wasn't a lot of parental supervision happening, you would love this book. It's extremely nostalgic in that way. However, the writing, he uses, I think it's very sing-songy. The writing was very, there were a lot of sentence fragments. There were a lot of single word sentences. There was a lot of phrases and words being repeated. And it really bothered me. And it made it hard to follow in a couple places, actually. I had to reread a few spots to know exactly what was going on. And then some of the descriptions of what the kids were doing at the time eluded me until I had, like I said, I had to reread a few places. It was like this the whole time. I just couldn't quite get on board with the writing here. However, this is a favorite for a lot of people. Scott Danielson told me this is one of his favorite books of all time. So I'm probably alone in my opinion of this book. But the story itself was really great. You follow a group of kids who go out on Halloween, and one of their friends is like kidnapped by some supernatural being, and another supernatural being takes the kids to try to rescue their friend, and they just go through different periods in history looking for their friend. Like they visit ancient Egypt, they visit, I can't even remember that, but they visit all kinds of different periods in history, and each period of history coincides with one of the kids' costumes. Like the reason they went to ancient Egypt is because one of the kids was a mummy. They visited witches out in the forest because one of the kids was dressed as a witch. So it was a really great story. I just felt the execution was not to my taste. Then I read 3 novellas by Lisa Hofmann, who is my favorite fantasy author. That's her name in case you want to look her up, and I highly recommend that you do. She's written short stories and novellas. She has 4 novellas out, a collection of short stories, and 3 books in a series that is actually going to be a quartet. The last book isn't out yet. She's in the process of writing that. But the first one was called Amber Flame, which is about a village that is being essentially held prisoner by a dragon. And in order to keep the dragon from causing destruction, they have to give up one of their young daughters every month to the dragon. And it's a group of towns that is being held captive by this dragon, and the towns rotate. Each month a different town sends a daughter to the dragon. And this is a 5-star read. It's fabulous. It's my favorite of her novellas and short stories. It's absolutely marvelous. And then I read Amelie, which is about a brother and sister who are aristocrats of some kind, and their castle is attacked and their family is all dead. And the mother, before she dies, gives them each an amulet an amulet that will shapeshift them. And the brother and sister get separated. You follow the sister, and you see what happens with the sister, and they do tell you at the end what happens with the brother, but I won't say that in case you want to read it. This was also a 5-star read. It was wonderful. And then I read Aura, which is about a group of children who can shapeshift into a phoenix, but they don't know that they can do that, and so it just happens sort of randomly. Within this 1-week period, they all shapeshift at various points, and they have no idea why or what's going on. And so you follow one of the kids as he figures out what's going on with their shapeshifting abilities. And then this is the other novella that she has out called Artemis's Wings, and I actually haven't read this one yet, but I just wanted to give it a shout out just because it was the 4th and final novella. Let's see, the next book that I read, kind of, was The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This was a buddy read with my friend John. I was kind of back and forth because it is classified as YA, and I do not tend to like YA novels. However, I love the cover. The cover's beautiful. Beautiful cover. and it has dragons. And my understanding was the dragons were intelligent and spoke, and those are the kind of dragons that I like. So I really, really wanted to read it because of the dragon action. I read about 100 pages of this and I had to DNF it. The whole thing is extremely political. After 100 pages, I didn't know if I wanted to keep reading it. I wanted to keep reading it if I was going to get some dragon action, because I hadn't had any. There was like 2 extremely short scenes that amounted to about a paragraph or 2 apiece with the dragons. So I flipped through the rest of the book and read 10 pages here, 10 pages there. There's not dragons in here. I mean, there is, but it's very brief, and they don't play like a huge role, as far as I could tell. Anyway, they don't play a big role in the story. And the whole thing is a lot of politics, and I don't like a lot of politically driven stories. It's very rare if I do like that sort of thing. It's kind of Game of Thrones-ish, only without all of the, sex and debauchery that happens in that show. So yeah, so I went ahead and DNF'd it. And then Steve Donahue was doing a reread of The Vampire Lestat with another booktuber whose name I can't remember. And I absolutely loved Anne Rice in my 20s. She was one of my favorite authors. And I read all the Vampire Chronicles, including all of the side ones like Vittorio and Pandora and all that. And so I thought, ooh, I'm going to reread that as well. And I got about 106 pages in. And then I never made it any further. I am going to finish rereading it. What I read, loved. Oh my gosh, loved it just as much as I did when I was in my 20s and read it. And I was very glad that I read this, because the part where I stopped is actually right after Lestat gets turned into a vampire by Magnus. And I say that I was super thrilled that I had decided to read this, and that just happens to be where I stopped, because the next book I read was Count Magnus and Other Ghost Stories by M.R. James. I read this, but he read this with Shawn Standfast. This is one of his favorite authors. This is actually a 2-book for the complete stories. It's actually 2 volumes. I do have the other volume, but I didn't read that one. And I only got, ignore that back bookmarker, that's for the notes. I got that far in. It was about halfway through this. Every story in here fabulous. Loved all of them. I'm super in love with these ghost stories now, and I will definitely finish this. However, the first one I read was Count Magnus, because that's on the cover of the book, Count Magnus. And I read that story and I realized Anne Rice also read these, because Count Magnus in her book, Who Changes Lestat, is definitely the Count Magnus in M.R. James's short story for sure. Then another buddy read with Shawn was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I have always loved Jane Austen, and I've always said that this is my favorite of her novels. I started reading this. I got to page 121 and I didn't have a chance to finish, but I will finish it. And I am possibly going to be eating a little crow here. I almost hate to admit this, but I am not enjoying this as much as I did when I read it when I was younger. I realized that I had thought that it had been not terribly long ago when I read it the last time, but it actually has been about 13 years since I've read this. The reread I was thinking of was actually for Pride and Prejudice. So yeah, by the time I'm done, I could be eating some crow. It's not as good as I remember. And finally, I read a few things on Kindle. The first one was called Little Free Library by Naomi Kritzer. I'll put the cover here. And it's a short story, about 30 pages, about this woman who puts a little free library up in her front yard, fills it with books, and the books immediately disappear. And as it turns out, her little free library is an exchange portal to some other dimension or world or time period or something. I thought it was a real nice story, and I really did enjoy that. So the next 2 Kindle books I'm going to talk about I actually read in November, but because November, all my other reads for November were for New World's November and How for the Holidays, and I've already done a video for that. I just thought I would just throw them in with this video. So the first Kindle story I read was called Bright Winter Night by Allie Bryden. It's actually a children's story. It takes place in a forest, and a little group of animals get together to build a sled to go see the Northern Lights. And it was so sweet. I just absolutely loved it. It's a wonderful children's book, and the illustrations were beautiful. Then I also read It's Not Hansel, Hansel and Gretel by Josh Funk, which is sort of a different take on the Hansel and Gretel story. It's where Hansel and Gretel are actually interacting with the narrator and contradicting the way he's telling the story. I'm sure it's cute. I didn't particularly care for it. I like the traditional Hansel and Gretel story myself and didn't enjoy that one very much. But I think that modern children and parents will actually enjoy that. Okay, so that does it for my October reads and my 2 little Kindle reads from November. And I'll call that the end of the video.